Hello, friends. This is the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the Alphalist podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today I welcome Dr. Melanie Rieback, tuned in from Amsterdam. And Melanie is CEO and co-founder of Radically Open Security, which you can find under the funny domain radical.sexy, and founder of Nonprofit Ventures. And today we talk about cyber, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, in your consultancy, you focus on pen testing. So would be nice to hear a bit more about like your thoughts about like typical attack vectors today, and like maybe a few war stories, etc., so that some of my listeners can maybe figure out a few things they need to change on their architecture as well. But first of all, let's start with the name of your company. What makes you radically open?
Yeah, so I'm Melanie from Radically Open Security. I'm the CEO and co-founder. We are a 10-year-old cybersecurity company in the penetration testing space primarily. So what this means is that companies, governments, nonprofit organizations hire us in to break their computer systems, infrastructure, networks, embedded systems, crypto, blockchains. And we basically tell them how we broke it and give them recommendations for how to fix it. So it's quite a fun job. We're about a 10-year-old company. We have roughly 50 staff members. We've had about 150 customers, ranging from Google and Mozilla to the European Commission and the Dutch energy grid to, hosting providers, banks, insurance companies, telcos, literally core internet, like internet exchanges and and for the rest, about a third of our clientele is actually in the not-for-profit space. So we do work for nonprofits, NGOs, and civil society organizations on a not-for-profit basis at cost price. So basically at zero margin. We are a social enterprise in the cybersecurity space, which already makes us a bit different. And what definitely makes us different is first that we're steward-owned, we're foundation-owned, and we also give 90% of our profits to charity. And that makes us, of course, very different. The last 10% is our cash flow buffer that we use to make payroll at the end of every month. And in the first 8 book years, we're currently closing book year 9, we managed to donate about 800,000 euros to the NLNet Foundation. And that's a Dutch internet-related charity that then redistributes those funds to open source projects, digital rights initiatives, and anything for a better open internet. You would certainly recognize some of the names of those who are receiving that money, things like GNU, the Tor project, DNSSEC, WireGuard, Jitsi, basically a whole bunch of usual suspects in the open source and open internet space.
And why do you do that? I mean, it's kind of like, why did you come up with that idea initially?
Yeah, so I came up with this idea initially because, I've been in cybersecurity now for over 20 years, and I have quite some friends that have gotten a bit burned out from the industry, just in the sense that it spends so much time acting really commercial. And oftentimes there's a bit of an ethics problem in the industry. So companies will do things like, basically develop surveillance systems, sell them to developing countries. They'll work with intelligence agencies. I know that opinions might be split on how okay that is. Some people find it's fine. Other people think not so much. They also hack activists, things like Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion. In either case, quite a number of the Dutch hacker community were very against this, and it sort of came to heads about 10 years ago at a organic homegrown community hacker camp called Observe Hack Make. And basically the actual ticket sales were boycotted by both the Dutch hacker community and the German Chaos Computer Club back then, because one of the chief sponsors, sort of fit these categories. And they actually created at the time a sort of a camp within a camp called Noisy Square that was dedicated to the discussion of ethics within the cybersecurity industry. So at the time, it was incredibly evident to me that the hackers were not so happy about the choice of employers. At the same time, also, I was working at the time at ING Bank in their cybercrime team. And I also dealt with some of these consultancy companies also from the customer side. At one particular moment, we had a very large DDoS attack that got us some unwelcome media attention. Mind you, this was back, I think, in 2003, 2004. And, one of these consultancies, they kind of parachute in and they're like, stand back, we will solve the problem for you. And I was just like, yeah, okay. So I'm the lead researcher of the CSERT team here at the bank. If you're so lead, I can probably learn a whole bunch from you. And then they looked at me and they were like, cybersecurity is hard. And I was just like, okay, guys, I used to be an assistant professor of computer science specialized in cybersecurity at the Free University of Amsterdam. Why don't you try me? But they kept deleting log files, turning off logging when they were working in screen and things like that. And eventually I just physically stood next to them and looked over their shoulder because that was the one way they couldn't get rid of me. And sure enough, they were using the same open source tools as everyone else, but they didn't want you to know that because they wanted you to believe that, security is this kind of black magic that only they can do, and I was just upset because I was just this is total crap. So basically I decided, between this and the discontent from the hacker community that, look, I mean, the customers aren't really happy with how commercial this is all going. The hackers aren't happy either. I think there's a hole in the market. And that was when I decided to make the decision to leave the bank and to start Radically Open Security. And I really made kind of a not-for-profit business model for the company because I really wanted to make it clear that we were different, and I wanted to put my money where my mouth was. Because it's one thing to say, oh, look, I'm a social enterprise, and then everybody's like, oh, okay, great. What does that mean? Because there's so much greenwashing these days. But I figured by, first of all, giving away my company for €1 to a foundation, and secondly, also with this fiscal fundraising institution hack that we used, it's basically a fiscal construction that locks us into donating 90% of our profits. I mean, what more can I do? I've basically architected the company in such a way that I will never get rich from it. And the thing is, if there are no shareholders with a profit motive, then really the only reason for being left for such an organization is social impact. And that was the point that I wanted to make. So, of course, when I first started it, nobody even thought that you could donate 90% of your profits and still survive as a company. The reason, at the beginning, I didn't know if I could do it either. But the reason for confusion is because people think that we're donating 90% of our revenues. That's not it. If we donated 90% of our revenues, we couldn't run a company. But 90% of our profits is basically what we have left over after all of our staff and subcontractors are paid, after we've made all necessary investments in growth and stability of the company and paid for all kinds of overhead. I'm kind of useless managerial overhead, So it's the kind of thing that all these costs first need to, we can even, if we need to, make reserves for next year for expenditures that we know are coming up. If we want to buy new servers, we can already create a reserve for that if we like, so we don't have to donate that away. So it's a bit of a detailed bookkeeping exercise. And it can create a little bit of cash flow havoc if you get it wrong, but it always equalizes in the year after. So it's a bit of a ballet with money. It's not necessarily the most practical way to run a company, but it's perfectly possible. And we've shown that actually a company can basically donate all of its non-reinvested profits and not only survive, but thrive. And again, the fact that we have such a I think quite broad, customer portfolio combined with the size of our company. We're also still growing. We regularly win RFPs against much larger, competitors. So yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, we're kind of proving that it can be done, and we're also trying to inspire other, entrepreneurs and also tech entrepreneurs to dare to create a not-for-profit company just purely for the impact, and I think this resonates with a lot of techies because a lot of techies are also into open source. And definitely the hacker community also is very open source minded by and large. So I think that this is the reason why it works. It tends to attract actually very high quality staff members and also a lot of like-minded customers. And it also just so happens that the CISOs who actually get us in the door of their companies and fight procurement battles for us, they also oftentimes happen to be a member of the hacker community as well.
Yeah. I can imagine. I recently visited the CCC event here in Hamburg, and I can really imagine that it resonates well with those people there, right? Because many are striving for like bigger things, and not just I don't know, a normal salary, but want to be different, and I think that works out quite well. And I can imagine that. And you also started like way earlier than, let's say, many of your greenwashing competitors, right? I can imagine that it's a good fit for the scene. But maybe let's step back a little. You told us that you worked for ING and that you worked as an assistant professor in the past. What sparked your initial interest in cybersecurity, and what is your nerd journey, let's say?
That started early. So back when I was probably, 8 years old, I can remember learning my first bits of programming. It really started with my parents. So back at the time, I lived in Naperville, Illinois, and both of my parents worked for Bell Labs. And for those who aren't as old as us, of course, Bell Labs was sort of the Google back in the day. And so my parents had, a really old, 8086 machine with a, with a 300 baud modem. And, I used to basically log in, to play NetHack. This was my misguided youth, and around the same time also, I started learning GW Basic, which was sort of, the programming language at the time. Also, I remember in elementary school, also starting with Logo. I don't remember how many of you know that little like turtle, that could kind of like draw on the screen. So I kind of started from a really young age, and I was really fortunate to be young in that kind of an environment because, of course, also in Naperville there were a lot of other engineers around from Bell Labs, and they sent their kids there. So I was just very fortunate, I think, to be in such an environment. My father was basically a telecommunications hardware manager, and my mother was a C programmer.
Wow.
Yeah, so I really had, the role models from the very beginning. It's not to say I didn't try to rebel. I mean, at a certain point, when I first enrolled for my bachelor's at the university, my parents told me I needed to either be a doctor or a lawyer. And I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer, so I actually enrolled as pre-med. But it was actually, I think, halfway through my first year when I had to take a required computer science class that I realized that I could add a double major, basically a second major in computer science, just to like make my childhood hobby, actually my my career as such. And I graduated with a double major in biology and computer science. And then, of course, what's the logical thing to do after that? Well, you go into bioinformatics. So I worked, I did actually my senior thesis at the university on molecular modeling. I also had a summer internship in the same area on proteomics. And when I graduated, I got a job on the Human Genome Project at MIT. And this is back in 2001, at the crux of the human genome race between Celera Genomics and the public effort. So I was in the Eric Lander lab, which was part of the public effort. So I'm actually one of the very, 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 very long list of co-authors on the original human genome sequencing paper that was published in Nature. So it was a really exciting time to be there. Of course, being at a place like MIT, I realized that if you only had a bachelor's degree, there was a glass ceiling. So I wanted to go back to grad school. I also, at the time I was just in the States, I wanted to see Europe because everything just seemed so magical and interesting at the time. And that was when I decided to move to the Netherlands. I went to grad school. I did my master's at the Technical University of Delft. And that was actually when I made my pivot away from bioinformatics into cybersecurity, when I actually realized that all that stuff that looked so fun when I was a kid, but that I didn't dare to do because it was illegal, that now I could actually get study points for it. So it felt like the biggest coup. So I made my switch then. I did my master's thesis on intrusion detection. And then from there, I got a PhD position with Andrew Tannenbaum, who a few people might know from Minix and some of his computer science textbooks. But he required me to switch my topic to ubiquitous computing and the security and privacy of that. I was just like, okay, it was a chance to get to work with Andy, so you don't say no to that. So I switched my topic. I eventually settled after my first year on security and privacy of radio frequency identification technology. So, things like access cards and, public transit passes. And back in 2006, I wrote a paper that was called, "Is Your Cat Infected with a Computer Virus?" So I basically had come up with the very first proof of concept malware for RFID tags. Of course, nowadays it's kind of a no-brainer. Like, of course, they're just another untrusted data carrier. Duh, right? But of course, back in 2006, it wasn't yet obvious. Someone had to be the first. So I wrote this paper, and it exploded. It went viral. So basically, it was on the front page of the papers. It was in the New York Times. It was I literally had an antivirus company taking out full page ads debunking my research. Which if you're a grad student and that happens, you know that you've made it. Yeah, I think the crux actually was the chief privacy officer at Philips one time looked me in the face and said, "Your research is bad for my company." So that was a very interesting time. At that time, I also built an embedded device called the RFID Guardian, which was basically it was one of the very first RFID cloning devices. But it could also do relay and replay and fuzzing and all kinds of different things and spoofing and jamming. And I built 3 different versions of it. We made our own hardware, ported the real-time OS, and developed all the way up the stack. I wanted to valorize it, this was around 2007, 2008. We all know what happened to the economy at that time. So first, what happened was the company that was helping me with the prototype that was located in the Bay Area, it turns out they had, unbeknownst to me, subcontracted the work to Indian subcontractors. But when they lost money because of the decline of the economy, they stopped paying these Indian subcontractors, who then took my prototype as a hostage in a labor dispute. So all of a sudden, yeah, you can't make this up. So all of a sudden, progress stopped on the device, and I was like, "What's going on? Why are things no longer happening?" And it went on like this, for months. And then eventually, the funding agency, who had promised me an extra year of funding, they also lost a bunch of money when the stock market collapsed. And that last year of funding that they'd promised me just dried up. And I was scrambling around trying to find other sources of money. But it didn't work out. And of course, hardware that's like 90% done is basically a doorstop. So I like to call it my first failed startup. Every entrepreneur has one of those stories. At that point, that was when I decided to leave the university, which was painful because a lot of my identity was really tied up in being an assistant professor. But I moved for a period to Vancouver, Canada, to work at Citrix on the Zen hypervisor team. I was basically in charge of a product that was called, I was leading the Vancouver office and working as an engineering manager on Zen Client, which was basically a client side implementation of Zen. After that, product didn't do very well, so I got laid off. Then I traveled for a while, and then I eventually went back to the Netherlands and worked at ING and went in their cybersecurity team. And sort of, from there I started Radically Open Security, and the rest is history.
Wow. That's a crazy story. So very impressive. Then I have a follow-up question. Is my cat infected with the virus?
You never know.
But I mean, looking at today's technology, let's say NFC, BLE, RFID, did that evolve security-wise, or like how much would you trust your, let's say, NFC keys or Bluetooth LE keys?
Yeah. So at the time when I was doing the research, a lot of the products, it was still sort of, remember, this was 2 decades ago. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the tags, of course, they're inductively powered by the reading devices that read them out. And the further away the reading device is, also the power exponentially decreases. So the problem here is that a lot of the early tags didn't really have enough power to be able to have enough processing capacity to do strong crypto on the chips. So, of course, it depended on how far away, basically what the reading range was of the tag itself. But indeed, with the early things like the PET chips, there basically were more or less no strong access controls on things like that. So you could basically just rewrite it. That's, of course, what my paper was pointing out. Of course, at a certain point, you started getting, particularly also for the close proximity tags, they can get more power from the reading devices. Of course, in the last 20 years, semiconductors have not stood still. So, of course, now you can pack a lot more transistors into a much smaller area, which also requires less power. So I would say the capacity of the tags nowadays is better than it was at that time. It also depends on cost, of course, because, of course, lower cost tags also are going to usually have fewer transistors. And so oftentimes cost also plays a role, beyond also size of the antenna. So there's a number of factors, but I would say, though, that the sky hasn't fallen. People are still using RFID for logistics. I think that it's just like any other technology in the sense that there are cost and benefit analyses. It's not perfect. You can still, it's still yet another untrusted input source. Strong crypto helps, but my RFID Guardian didn't succeed, but the Proxmark, which was also a contemporary at the time, they built a much simpler product, which is, I think, why their product succeeded when mine failed. The Proxmark is still around, and pen testers on my team, they use the Proxmark quite regularly, to clone access cards and things during penetration tests. So the system isn't perfect, but then again, no system is perfect. So at the end of the day, it's more just that it needs to be architected well enough for the attacker model, and also given the kinds of crown jewels that you're trying to protect, and just the specifications of the system and budget.
But for your home, would you trust it more than an old key?
No. Well, depends. No, we do lock picking also at my company, so it depends on the lock. I'll tell you a funny story. One time I had a pet sitter over because I was, both me and my partner, we were on holiday, and the partner had turned on basically started cooking something and then went outside to let somebody else into the house, and then left their keys in the house. And we basically wound up having to call the fire department to come to try and basically break down the door to get back into the apartment to prevent a fire. Thank goodness they did get there in time. But the door wasn't even locked; it had just closed and went click. But we had a pretty strong lock on it, and it took the fire department, I think, at least somewhere between a half hour and an hour to get in to break the lock. So in that sense, I definitely trust the lock quite a bit more.
Okay. Maybe coming to, let's say, more, applicable areas for our listeners. I wanted to get like a little security update. What is cracking these days? From your perspective, what are the most typical attack vectors these days that maybe my listeners should be aware of? What is it like if you have an office and if you don't have an office these days?
Yeah. So I would say that as usual, I mean, complexity is the big problem with a lot of different organizations, particularly with the large ones that would have the kinds of CTOs that are probably listening to your podcast. The problem is that these organizations are so large that the attack surface is oftentimes completely unclear. For the largest organizations, like take an ISP, or some kind of multinational, they have absolutely no idea what's on their network, what devices are there. In fact, the perimeter of the network is completely unclear. And certainly since COVID, also given the whole work from home movement, of course, now the boundaries of the office network have also extended into people's homes, and Lord knows what kind of Chinese smart devices and whatnot are attached to those networks. So we've really moved to a point where you have to assume that network perimeters really don't exist, and that attacks always can come from the inside, which of course points towards things like zero trust models in the implementation. That being said, also the sheer size of the attack surface also leads to lots of bloated software, which has monumental numbers of lines of code, not to mention dependencies. Of course, supply chain security nowadays also is particularly a hot topic. And statistically speaking, there's 16 bugs for every 1,000 lines of code. So if you then look at the sheer size of the code bases plus dependencies that we're dealing with, I mean, it is literally statistically impossible to create safe software, which means that, and the problem is there's always an unfair advantage on the side of the attackers. It only takes us one vulnerability to be able to break in, but on the side of the defender, it's completely asymmetric because you have to fix all of the problems, to be able to keep us out. And that's impossible, of course. So, as a result of this, it's also assuming we're talking about multinationals now, but also for the smaller organizations, they're even worse off because oftentimes they lack the IT knowledge in-house to be able to do things properly, and sometimes they'll attempt to do it properly, but then, forget to do essential things like update their software, and of course the vast majority of break-ins occur using CVEs, using well-known vulnerabilities, oftentimes that have been patched and announced sometimes years ago. And there's all these script kiddie scanning tools that basically just trawl the whole internet looking for low-hanging fruit that they can break into. So, I mean, certainly unpatched software. I mean, I know it sounds like a no-brainer, but, and these are also the same kinds of problems we've had since the 1980s. But sadly, we haven't solved this one. And it's also not that easy either, just because the small guys don't have the internal capacity to be able to maintain it themselves. If they try outsourcing it, sometimes they'll outsource it to like some brothers, cousins, and neighbors, server that they're running somewhere, and oftentimes those small hosting providers aren't any better. And for the small parties, probably the best thing they can do is outsource it to larger, more well-known parties, perhaps Amazon's or Google's. But then they also have to look at their attacker model and their data governance requirements, and then also to try and figure out whether or not that is acceptable. And of course, particularly in Europe, oftentimes that isn't. And also on top of that, with the largest organizations like the multinationals, also it's really complex trying to keep your software up to date, because first it implies that you know what devices you have, because you need to know that they exist in order to patch them. And on top of that, just internal organizational politics of various business units within the organization, because if something needs to be patched, and then if a team doesn't, the question is, do you have either a carrot or a stick that you can use to enforce the patching? And there, of course, there's software that you could buy that helps, to track and manage patching throughout entire organizations. But it's difficult, it's political, it's not perfect. And yeah.
And what makes you party if I let's say I want you to pen test my services. I have a SaaS company, and you inspect my setup basically outside in. What makes you party? Like when do you celebrate that this is going to be an easy job? When you find my, let's say, WordPress, or when where I host my website, or when you know that I'm using, I don't know, Google as an IDP or Okta. Like what makes you party?
Party. Well, I mean, look, if you're using WordPress, then we can basically give you a finding in the pen test before we even get started. So, and believe it or not, we have found a few vulnerabilities during the scoping phase by accident. Anyhow, but the point is that I think that we party more when it's hard for us, because for us it's sort of, there's enough cases where things are easy. I mean, it's really unfortunate when you can basically just run scanning tools. And oftentimes, particularly with small characters, we will literally tell them, like, go run a scanning tool, fix the things first yourself, and then come back to us for the hard stuff, after you've sort of picked up the lowest hanging fruit yourself. So in that sense, I mean, I think the stuff that we generally tend to party more at is when we have to work a little bit harder for it. Because, I mean, look, if you pen test for years, all day, then, at a certain point, you're looking for a challenge, not for the lowest hanging fruit, right? Because that, I'm not going to say it gets boring after a while, but we like to do the fun and interesting stuff. So in that sense, but we there's so many really wonderful organizations that we have gotten to pen test. I mean, things like internet exchanges, which would have some of the most lockdown security that you can imagine, and yet we still get to I mean, all kinds of things. I mean, also embedded devices are really a lot of fun. One of our customers is actually the largest supermarket chain in the Netherlands, and they give us a really large number of assignments per year, and we get to pen test, sort of not just point of sale terminals, but like self-checkout kiosks, cash safes. So literally like money bag machines, we get to pen test. I mean, for us, that's the fun stuff. Like that's when we get those kinds of assignments in, we party. The other thing also where I think we party is when people ask us to pen test stuff that really gets used, like commonly used open source. And the fact that we get to pen test things like the Tor project and Tails and Shadow Socks and, but also just Google and, I mean, it's just super cool. I mean, also open source things like Homebrew, for example. We have a public pen test report that we did for them. Also, just like sometimes even just the little guys, like this little civil society organizations like Oxfam, Greenpeace. We wake up in the morning to be able to pen test those kinds of people. So so I would say that is really some of the highlights of what we get to pen test. Look, if people come to us with low hanging fruit, we pen test that too, because of course that's very important to pick up. But for us, I would say sort of like the quote unquote specials are kind of what's more fun from a party perspective. So.
And let's say the boring like for money projects, couldn't you just give out a list of recommendations that people need to work through before they can work with you? Actually, do you do that? Because I mean, WordPress is a good example, I guess, but there are many other things like these days that are maybe semi well known and you see everywhere, and you're kind of bored of.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm not going to tell people how to architect their systems. I mean, at the end of the day, they need to make their own trade-offs. And look, I mean, there might be compelling reasons for some organizations to use WordPress. I mean, it's easy, to manage. It's open source.
Battle tested.
Yeah. I mean, look, yes, we will definitely recommend that they move over to other CMSs. I mean, look, if it's up to us, they would all switch over to Jackal. But not everyone is willing to technically, capably be able to manage that. So at least if it's going to be hosted by somebody else, if it can be hosted by somebody who at least stays on top of it and also who keeps all the plugins up to date, because oftentimes we can break in through the plugins with that. And I mean, at least try and get them to scan these things regularly. I mean, also other things like just making backups and just assuming that if it is inevitably compromised, which it might be, what's the worst that can happen? I mean, if it's just somebody's personal blog, it might not matter. If you have good backups, then maybe you could just notice it's popped, put it back. I mean, I'm not saying this is optimal, but, it's not necessarily going to lead to personal theft of, sensitive details and personal PII and things like that. Not necessarily. So, I mean, I think you have to put things into context with their attacker model, with their budget. Because oftentimes if people are running WordPress, it's just because they don't have the budget to really be able to, or the knowledge to be able to do any better. I'm not excusing this. I will still tell them to migrate away from WordPress. But I mean, also some people are just intimidated by tech. So if you come with a list of better recommendations, they might just get overwhelmed by it. So again, I'm not saying that this is okay, but I am saying, though, that this is realistic, just because particularly for companies or organizations where tech is not their main thing inside the company. I mean, if you're talking about like a dentist's office or, some, woodworking, company that makes tables or something like that. I mean, they're not a tech company. But of course, a lot of these kinds of smaller SMEs, they do tend to get popped by ransomware reasonably frequently. So, and then it starts coming back to things like, do you have good backups? Are they restorable? Are they also offline? That kind of stuff.
And let's say I run a SaaS company, 15 people. I use WordPress, but I use like a secure WordPress hoster that updates my plugins, etc., etc. And I don't have an office, so you can't enter my office and ask for access to the server room, which is, I guess, a very typical attack vector still these days. Where do you smell like the next step? Like what is typically stuff that people don't spend enough time and money on?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is kind of the security common sense, basic security hygiene kinds of things, but looking at things like separation of concerns, how is their architecture structured? Who has access to what? Are they sort of isolating? And particularly for, asking the question, what are my crown jewels? right? And what do I think are my crown jewels? And what does the attacker think is my crown jewels? Because those two things are not always the same. So, and once you know that, it's not that you can't meaningfully protect everything. Because, when you try to protect everything, you're going to wind up protecting nothing. So instead, you just need to sort of figure out what it is that you really need to protect, isolate that, and make sure that you have the strongest security just on that part of it. So I think that is definitely part of it. I think other things like authentication, how are you handling this? Do you have two-factor available? What is your password policy? Is it manageable for people? How are you ensuring the passwords are rotated? And, are you using password vaults? Yes or no? And of course, there's plenty of arguments on both sides about why that's a good thing to do or why that's not a good thing to do. But
is it a good thing from your perspective to use, let's say, 1Password or LastPass or something? Or LastPass maybe not.
Yeah, but look, they're all vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think it depends. So I think the real question is, what's the alternative? If the alternative is people storing passwords on Post-it notes, then probably a password manager is better. I think if the alternative is flat text files that people are using to store all their internal passwords somewhere in the file system,
like that one file on the desktop, right? Or
people do it.
phone book entries.
Exactly. If that's the alternative, then definitely a password manager is far preferable. But they're single points of failure. Actually, my favorite method of passwords is, for the majority of passwords, especially the ones you don't care too much about, the whole like magic link idea, or in other words, sort of the I forgot my password button. So oftentimes I'll do this for websites that I don't care too much about. So I need to create an account to like buy, I don't know, like concert tickets or something, and but I really actually don't care so much about my account. So what I'll do is I'll have my browser automatically generate a strong password for me. And then it'll, my browser will say, do you want me to save, the password that you just generated? And then I'll click on no. So at that point, basically, I'm into my account. I have absolutely no idea what the password is. It just randomly created a strong one. And I buy my tickets, and that's that. And then the next time that I need to log into that account, I just click on I forgot my password, and I basically get a magic link kind of email to my email account. And basically what that means is that as long as my email account is secured with a strong password that I know, off the top of my head, then basically, because that backdoor exists anyways. So in that sense, almost having password vaults is almost no longer necessary if all of the different accounts actually have a readily usable I forgot my password function. And I really kind of prefer doing it that way. And it's also a really easy way to make sure you rotate passwords often enough. So
And what do you think? Like, it's very common practice that let's say you use 1Password or a similar vault, and you store your 2FA keys with your passwords. Isn't that a bit weird if you think about the idea of 2FA in the first place?
It's extremely weird. Yeah, separation of concerns, right? I separated. I don't put my 2FA. I'm not saying that like how I do it is perfect, but I definitely have it on a different device, than where the passwords, I would say, are being stored. So yeah. There's always room for improvement. I think if I were to hire somebody in my team to spend a couple months, I'm sure they could pop me too. But yeah.
So, Melanie, from your perspective, regardless of size, what should I do first? Storing passwords or like having a password policy kind of obviously makes sense. But after that, when it comes to software, and I update my software regularly, what is the next best step from your perspective? Is it I don't know, working with a company like you guys? Is it like which size should I care about security and how much? does it still work that you kind of have a security team in the company, or you rather work with externals? How do you see that?
Yeah. So basically, I think that it is important to get regular penetration tests on your infrastructure and also on your software. Also, sometimes on your organization. If you haven't, I mean, if you have the capacity to have an internal security team, then by all means you should. I mean, it is problematic sometimes to become dependent on externals. I mean, it was kind of like the story I told you at the beginning with, peeking over people's shoulder. I mean, the more you can build internal capacity within the company, you certainly should try. And of course, an organization as large as a bank, there's the budget to be able to do so. That being said, not every organization has that budget, or has that capacity, or is even an attractive or obvious enough place to be able to attract good quality cybersecurity professionals. And in that case, then I think you really don't have much of a choice but to find kind of a trusted external partner to work with. And in either case, I mean, you should always have, I would say, sort of a kind of a core team and an extended team. And even if you're a larger party like a bank or something, it's still, you need to have the external experts kind of on speed dial, or at least in your Rolodex, just put together a little yellow pages of like, in case a situation comes up, this is where I can find the externals. Also, particularly for incident response, make sure you negotiate rates before the incident happens. You'll get much better pricing. But as for penetration testing, most certainly, I mean, there's all kinds of companies out there like mine, but also many others. The whole principle is that you don't know how to defend your company until you understand how to attack your company. So, and you probably won't know how to attack your company because, I mean, pen testing is really something, it's a skill that takes decades really to learn and to perfect. So even with the whole within Radically Open Security, we have this peek over our shoulder method, which is basically our pen testing workflow that we work in chat rooms online. We use something called Rocket Chat, which is an open source self-hosted clone of Slack. And we invite the customers into our chat rooms to actually observe and interact with our hackers while we are busy breaking your stuff.
So, what are the fundamental cybersecurity practices that, from your perspective, every SaaS company, regardless of size, should implement? Is there the need for a security team at a certain point, or like how do you see that? Like just from your perspective, is it more the typical companies hire an expert at a certain point, like an external expert to do pen testing, or where do you start normally? Where if you want to invest into security, where to start?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think by and large, it's always a good thing to invest in your internal capacity for cybersecurity. However, that assumes that you have the financial resources to be able to do so. For larger organizations like a bank, that's realistic. For tiny organizations, of course, that isn't going to be doable. Which basically means that I would say for larger corporations, really, I think a good thing to do is indeed, build your own internal red team, build your own internal CSIRT, build your own internal, just other security architecture and other security departments, the SOC, But also, you might have a core team, but you should also make sure you have an extended team because, of course, when the moment comes that there's an emergency, and you need to have that yellow pages of external experts that you can have on speed dial to be able to get to. And the most important part is you want to make sure that you have negotiated rates before the emergency. That'll save you some money. So at that point, just like a core team, extended team model for large organizations is useful. For smaller organizations, I think that, the internal team, the core team is just not doable, which basically means you need to find, you really have no choice but to find external parties that you can cooperate with. And you can certainly find pen testing companies, like mine, but also like many others. And, they can then basically come in on an hourly basis, and just by the hour be able to help you with whatever it is that you need. And that is by far the cheapest way to be able to, and not just cheapest, but also the best way. Because, if you're a really tiny organization where security isn't the focus, you're going to have a lot of trouble hiring, quality security professionals, because you might not be a very obvious place for them to want to work. Smart security folks want to hang out with other smart security folks most of the time. So it's only even really feasible to be able to get that quality of cybersecurity service by hiring an external company. But just do insist that they're partners with you in the process, and that there's some amount of openness and transparency of process. At Radically Open Security, we have a workflow that's called Peek Over Our Shoulder for a pen testing process. And what this is we work online with chat rooms. So we use an environment called Rocket Chat, which is basically an open source self-hosted clone of Slack. And we invite customers into our chat rooms to interact with and observe our pen testers while we are busy breaking your stuff.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's great. And it kind of demyths the hacker a bit, right?
That's it. Yeah. The whole point of it really is just to really transmit the hacker mindset, particularly to developers, but also security officers and anyone else really involved, sysadmins, DevOps people, just with the idea that if they are actually inherently part of the process of breaking the stuff, then they understand, why those problems got there in the first place considerably more deeply. And security it's a long-term process, and it's a mindset. It's not just a set of patches that you get from a pen test report, and this is why I think that, also with openness and transparency of process from our side, it's also very efficient because customers are oracles for us. If we get blocked, if we have a question, if a server needs to be restarted, just having the customer there with such short communication lines is super handy and super efficient. So really the pleasure in that kind of communication goes both ways, and you can insist on having this kind of openness and transparency of process with any company, with any pen testing or security company that's giving you an engagement. So I would say that's also important, for CISOs or CTOs, also just to make sure that whichever vendors that you're working with, that they include you in the process, that they bring you along and educate you while it's happening, because ultimately we're going to leave. Right? You're paying us by the hour. So we're going to, and the real question becomes, are you still able to handle things correctly after we're gone?
Yeah, in many cases not, right? It's also a lot about education, right? And educating your people that the biggest attack vector, which is human, I think, is at least not as vulnerable as in other companies, right?
Yeah. So social engineering is always a thing, and it's getting harder and harder to tackle. Training is good. We do phishing tests for a number of our customers, and it certainly helps because, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit phishing going on. And a lot of people step into it. This is the reason why the attackers do it, because it pays. And yet, at the same time, it's also, if you have a dedicated attacker, it's very difficult not to walk into it because, one of my members of my pen testing team, if they took some time and targeted me, I would click without a doubt. So then the next question becomes, what kind of what kind of technical architecture do we have backing things up? So when the human inevitably fails, as even with a lot of awareness, they at some point will, what kind of backups do we have in place, to make sure that the whole situation isn't total loss when inevitably that phishing attack or whatnot does succeed. So I think that's basically the other part of it. And also just understanding that phishing is also getting a lot more broad than it used to be. It's not just phishing mails. I mean, sometimes they call you, sometimes they send SMSs, sometimes they'll send you messages on WhatsApp or Signal. And even now with things like deepfakes, it's getting really crazy and really creepy what people can produce now using open source software. We just recently were doing some CEO, what's it called? CEO deepfakes in my own company. Basically, one of my staff members had used some open source software to come up with a fake Melanie that basically was telling our financial guy to wire some money to a particular location. I mean, it was creepy how much it sounded like me. I mean, somebody who really knows me probably might have not fallen for it because a few of the intonations were a little bit different than how I would usually do it. But for somebody who doesn't know me very well, definitely for sure. I mean, they would fall for it. And even if it were, and you can make it interactive too. And the other thing is, really the only way I think that you can fight against those kinds of things is just indeed making it as interactive as possible and just like asking questions that you expect them to answer that they would need insider knowledge to be able to answer. And it's really interesting to also do those kinds of social engineering tests as well, because most people wouldn't even think of that kind of vector, but it's just getting good enough nowadays that even your phishing / social engineering test should incorporate those kinds of things as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds horrible. I hope I'm speaking to the real Melanie and not some LLM that is producing great pictures and voice.
After we did that deepfake test, I actually made jokes about the fact that I wanted to create my own deepfake that could give all my interviews for me. Save me some effort.
Last question back on investments. I think like before. I mean, working with a pen test company also means like working with other people, and for many technical people, it's actually like first step is rather to invest into technology and other software, and if you like, let's say back in the SaaS space, then many companies want to sell you like multi-tenant enterprise plans, IDPs, MDMs, and many things that make you put more things into one basket. Is that per se a bad thing to put more things in one basket, or is it okay as long as you separate concerns? Like, how is it from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a bit of a ideological answer because I'm actually an incredibly large open source zealot. So my entire company runs off of open source. So basically all of our infrastructure, all of our monitoring systems, all of our hacking tools, with the hacking tools there's a few exceptions. We use Burp Pro and IDA Pro, but except for that, pretty much everything else is open source. So what I would say is that I think that proprietary software does have a number of problems. Namely, there's vendor lock-in, which means that oftentimes a lot of intelligence that's gathered by the vendor gets shipped back to the vendor and it's not shared with you. And I think that that's problematic. And the other thing also is that you only have access to those systems for as long as you keep paying. So, I mean, that really kind of locks you into that ecosystem. Whereas if you're using open source and you don't like the vendor that's helping to service the open source, then you just go to another vendor, who is used to dealing with the same software. So, and even if you stopped getting support in theory and insourced it as well, you're no longer dependent and you can continue owning the things that you set up. So in that sense, I would tend to push people in the direction of open source solutions. A lot of people think, but that's too complex and we need to set it up and configure it and that's more work and we might not have the capacity. I can imagine that there's probably some cases where that's true. And in those cases, if you really don't have the internal capacity, then it could be that buying a proprietary solution that aggregates everything could be a better idea. But by and large, though, you're creating an incredibly expensive dependence on a third party. And I think it's just way smarter to instead build your internal capacity to be able to manage this kind of stuff yourself, because it's going to give you a kind of continuity that you wouldn't have with these third party vendors. I'm pretty sure that some other security professionals would give you other other answers, but that's also because sometimes they're financially incentivized to do so.
Okay, then I have a good closing question and surprise for you. So thanks a lot. Was very nice interview, but my outro question comes with a little surprise. So you are using a tool called IDP, an open source federated identity provider. Did you actually know that it has a security hole that leaks your credentials and allows people to physically travel back in time to your younger self? And I just figured that out. And we basically have the chance to like hack into your IDP and travel back in time to the time when you worked as a senior managing consultant for a bank that you also named before in 2013. And you basically were working for the cybercrime emergency response team. And it was the year 2013. And we now travel back in time and observe young Melanie trying to hack the bank and protect the bank as well. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Melanie's ears. What would it be?
Oh, geez.
Apart from don't use IDP, it has a security hole.
But before I answer the question about the advice I would give my younger self, first let me say something about IDP. We have found vulnerabilities. The developer of IDP is actually one of the members of our own team at Radically Open Security. So we work together really closely with the developer. We've performed pen tests on it, and of course, yes, just like with any piece of software, there are vulnerabilities sometimes. And we're actually right now one of the dependencies. I'm not going to tell you which one, but one of the dependencies that IDP uses is vulnerable. And we actually just right before Christmas did a coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And it's not just IDP that's using this library, but it's many other things. So keep your eye open because
it's Ruby, right? It's a Ruby software.
I can't tell you what it is, but what I can say is there's a 90-day disclosure term. So at that point, we'll probably be putting up a blog post. So your hypothetical joke actually right now we are in the middle of fixing, but it doesn't involve time travel.
And you didn't yet find the time machine feature?
No. No, but and I won't say more for another 90 days. But what I can say is that advice for my younger self, I think, is just I would say to believe in myself. Because of course, when I first started Radically Open Security, I had, it took 6 months, probably before we had any kinds of really serious revenue going. I mean, as it always is with startups. And I left, a job at the bank, which had a permanent contract and a really great salary. And, and a lot of people thought I was going to fail because, I was creating a not-for-profit company that donated all of its profits and everyone thought I was crazy, And I just sort of had this vision in my head of what was possible. And I just followed it. And in the beginning, I had total imposter syndrome. I felt like, I'm just like pretending I'm an entrepreneur. I'm just like sitting in my living room playing entrepreneur when I really have a fake company, not a real company. It took a few years before my fake company really started feeling real. And of course, now, we're about to have our 10-year anniversary and I'm basically flying our entire team actually to Croatia now
Cool.
To get the whole team together. So I'd say by now it's undeniable that we're a real company. But of course at the beginning, it felt just like I was going through the motions. They always say, like, fake it till you make it. We weren't faking it. It was just more, but it feels like faking it because of the imposter syndrome. So I would basically just say, and if I think about what I thought that I could achieve at that time, not only was I right back then, but this has already far exceeded my wildest expectations. Because it's not just that we've managed to build a thriving company, but it's also that the actual method of entrepreneurship itself, with the whole like not-for-profit business stuff. I actually at a certain point did a bit of pivoting and also put more attention into the business model and teaching it. And I actually created a methodology called Post Growth Entrepreneurship. And I've been teaching this to other entrepreneurs because after 4 or 5 years, other founders started approaching me to say, hey, Melanie, nice company you've got. Can you help me to start my company in a similar fashion with a similar business model? So I created Nonprofit Ventures about 4 or 5 years ago. And we've had 4 cohorts of roughly 12 to 15 founders. So we've incubated a little less than 60 companies in the incubator, and they all have a focus on nonprofit entity forms, steward ownership, and cross-subsidizing charity with their profits. And not just that, we're managing to build a thriving community around this, but I created a class at the University of Amsterdam in the business school called Post Growth Entrepreneurship that I am now teaching, like I had the first class yesterday, to 120 third-year bachelor students, and it's officially part of the economics and sustainability minor, and it's worth 6 European credit points. The fact that our company laid the groundwork for this, now that's even, and now that it's the second year we're teaching this, also the Autonomous University of Barcelona also hired me in to create a 2-module degrowth entrepreneurship module, which is basically same material, it's just different name. So it's actually spreading to a second business school now. And also in 2024, I'm going to also be spending some time on the road also to promote this next to my company. Also kind of part of the celebrations for the 10-year anniversary of my company. I'm going to be taking a little mini travel sabbatical just because I can, because 10 years is a long time. So that's sort of what I would say. Just like, believe in yourself, because not only is it going to succeed, but it's just going to become so much more than you ever imagined.
Okay. I think you don't have to whisper so much. You're doing so many great things that you don't need to change so many, so much of what you're doing, right? So congratulations on that, and thanks for the conversation. It was really great. Looking forward to meet you again, hopefully at a certain point. And have a great day.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Alphalist podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. Alphalist is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on Alphalist, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.